and very interesting presentations. And I'm sure that's what he has for us tonight. So without further ado, let me introduce our Vice President, Phil Vitiello.
Well, thank you everyone for being here tonight. Hopefully everybody get a kick out of this and enjoy it. Well, here we go. So the Rains brothers have been mostly overlooked by most historians, and they were outstanding munition makers whose innovation did much to improve the art of administering violent death. Gabriel James Rains was born June 1803 in New Bern, North Carolina. The development of the first modern mechanically fused high explosive landmines was attributed to Rains. And by the end of the Civil War, nearly 2,000 standard pattern Rains mines had been deployed. George Washington Rains. The younger brother Gabriel was born in Craven County, North Carolina, 1817. Graduated from West Point, class of 1842. Served as a chemistry teacher for the military academy. Becomes president of the Iron Works in Newburgh, New York. And at the start of the Civil War, he chose allegiance to his native North Carolina state. A skilled engineer and inventor, he was instrumental in providing the Confederacy with much needed gunpowder, and we will talk about that a little bit later on. Together, these two were known in history as the Bomb Brothers. That's in case anybody tried to fall asleep on my talk. All right. So the Civil War, as most historians might say, it's the breeding ground for modern warfare, known for many of its firsts. As a lot of us know, ironclad navies, first machine guns, electrically exploded bombs and torpedoes. My favorite Civil War first, aircraft carrier. Another Civil War first, the first submarine in the history of the world to sink a ship in combat. Now, the Rains brothers, they were inventive for sure, and they were inventive in some of the things they developed, but more so than really developing anything along that line. It was really more, I thought, in the tactics and the strategies of what they would do throughout the war. They kind of changed tactics. And by the end of the war, it was more like a World War I than anything farther back than maybe like the War of 1812. In the first month, 1864, an expert from the Confederate Torpedo Bureau, he's going to enter the office of President Jefferson Davis with a curious object. An iron casing, heavily black for all the world, looks like a lump of coal, designed to be tossed in a Union coal barge. The president turning it in his hands, turning it around and feeling, he says, perfection itself. This is made to explode in a furnace or on a ship. This is the work of General Gabriel Rains, 58 years old when the war began. Now, this is late in the war, November 27, 1864. This coal bomb was put into action, and one of its first victims is going to be the captured blockade runner, the Greyhound. The Greyhound also served as Major General Benjamin Butler's floating command post at this time, and aboard the unarmed steamer was Butler with his 51-year-old Rear Admiral David Dixon Porter, now commanding the North Atlantic Blockading Squadron. So the meeting there on the ship's upper deck, and they were discussing the pending attack on Fort Fisher, Wilmington, North Carolina, which was the last port on the eastern seaboard open to blockade runners. To put it in plain words, the Greyhound especially was a high value target because Porter was on board and Benjamin Butler were on board. Admiral Porter was especially suspicious as you see some men loading coal aboard the ship. And as the ship headed downstream, a huge explosion rocked the engine room. Porter knew instantly what had happened, and he was convinced it had to be one of the coal torpedoes that he had been told about during his time in the Western rivers. Later, he would write this: when the torpedo was thrown into the furnace with the coal, it soon burst, blowing the furnace doors open and throwing the burning mass into the fire room where it communicated with the woodwork. Now, fortunately for Porter and for Butler, they got off the boat safely. In fact, no one died on the ship except for Benjamin Butler lost a couple of his prized horses, but the ship was a total loss. So now I want to talk a little bit about the Peninsula Campaign, because this is the first large-scale offensive in the Eastern Theater, and this is going to take place in March and May of 1862. Some of the key leaders in this campaign are going to be Gabriel Rains, George B. McClellan, who is in charge and command of the Army of Potomac, the Union forces. We have General Joe Johnson there, and John Magruder, a Confederate general, and he's going to provide some delaying tactics. So I want to talk a little bit about this campaign because of the effect of what Rains will have on it with Magruder. It actually was a brilliant strategy by McClellan, what he wanted to do. He wanted to take his 150,000 man army by river and dump them out at Fortress Monroe, basically on the doorstep of Richmond. At that time, President Lincoln and Secretary of War Stanton were not really proponents of that because they really wanted to keep the Union Army between Richmond and Washington so Washington can always be protected. But McClellan got his way, and he convinced them this was the way to go. He promised Lincoln that he would leave plenty of men behind to cover Washington. After he left, Lincoln and Stanton were doing a head count and realized he left them a little short. But nevertheless, McClellan is going to go by sea. And actually, if McClellan wasn't such a conservative general, he might have pulled it off. There was a very good chance he could have taken Richmond very early in the war, and it might have changed the war entirely. In fact, it might have ended the war within the first year. So what happens is he puts together a flotilla, he takes them down Chesapeake Bay, and they are going to disembark at Fortress Monroe, right here. His objective is going to be Richmond. You can see on the upper left circle. And he's going to move forward. Confederates are in Yorktown. And at that time, Magruder only has about 5,000 troops on hand to oppose McClellan. So he does a really cool thing. He actually, up in the distance in the hills, he actually marching these guys around in literally like circles, uphill and down. And from a distance, McClellan is going to misread how many men he is up against, and that is going to slow him down. The other thing that'll have a major effect is Gabriel Rains. Gabriel Rains is going to plant landmines throughout the roads in Yorktown and around buildings and telegraph poles to slow him down, and he does. And that's going to bog down McClellan from initially moving forward quickly. They're going to fall back again to Williamsburg and again to the outskirts of Richmond. McClellan will follow suit through Yorktown, where he was delayed, and continue to pursue. And as we know in history, he gets to within about 5 miles of Richmond. Literally, they can hear the church bells and see the church spires in the distance. That's as far as he gets, because that delay by Rains with the landmines and Magruder will delay him enough that Joe Johnson will eventually be there with the main force, which will then turn into the Battle of 7 Days. So McClellan's opportunity to take Richmond was delayed and slowed by Rains and Magruder. With the guidance of Rains, the Confederate soldiers had hidden crude explosive devices in the sandy soil around Yorktown. Towns, streets, roads, inside houses, around telegraph poles. You kind of look at this little bit of an illustration there. So it would be like a canister. It could be filled with a powder charge, with a primer, and maybe there might be a board over it to hide the primer, maybe not, maybe some brushes, and any unsuspecting soldiers or horses walking over it, that could set off the landmine. So that's the kind of typical landmine they would set up throughout the roads around Yorktown and Williamsburg. After Yorktown was abandoned in early May of 1862, Union forces reported serious injuries and a few deaths from these booby traps. Rains was conflicted about using buried shells with so many civilians on the few roads fleeing the Union advance. Rains decided against indiscriminately burying the mines. Mining the fortifications in town was a different story altogether. So he was having some qualms about putting these booby traps of mines just anywhere because of his concern for civilians. Following the Battle of Williamsburg on May 5th, Rains suppressed his earlier qualms about mining the roads, and he does it to cover the retreat of his wounded. He had soldiers bury 4 artillery shells on the main road leading to Richmond. A Union cavalry advance would come to a standstill when the shells exploded on contact with the horse's hooves. Years later, Rains boasted, "These 4 shells checkmated the advance of 115,000 men under General McClellan and turned them from their line of march." Gabriel Rains' successes with landmines set off a new debate over using weapons that weight to maim or kill soldiers rather than against just boats and ships. This was a new kind of warfare. The press was claiming rebel barbarity against the mines that exploded in wells, bags of flour, homes, and telegraph poles. They were appalled to hear what was happening down south with these mines. In response to the mines, Union General McClellan vowed to make the prisoners remove the mines at their own peril, and soon he began ordering Confederate prisoners to clear the mines at Yorktown. Major General Joseph E. Johnston, the Confederate commander on the peninsula, was hesitant to condone their use. He was a little bit on the fence about it. He didn't really approve, but he didn't want to condone it either because he knew it would help him. But there was another Confederate general, and that's General James Longstreet. However, openly condemned Rains' actions at Yorktown and Williamsburg. He was totally against this kind of warfare. And he and Johnson were not seeing eye to eye at all. And they were having some very strong disagreements about how to manage the campaign with these mines. Finally, Confederate Secretary of War Randolph finally steps in to end the increasing heated argument between Johnson and Longstreet. Randolph, who was Thomas Jefferson's grandson, drafted a series of do's and don'ts that may have eased some of the consciousness of how it was becoming total war. So George Randolph is going to try to put together a landmine policy for them to follow. And this is what he's going to say. It is admissible to plant shells in a parapet to repel assault or in a road to check pursuit. It is not admissible to plant shells merely to destroy life and with no other design than that of depriving the enemy of a few men. Gabriel Rains is now appointed the head of the newly created Torpedo Bureau by Jefferson Davis. And a few months later, the Bureau filled General Robert E. Lee's order for hundreds of torpedoes and mines to bar the James River to enemy shipping. The James River would be the waterway access to get to Richmond. Rains said that the torpedo approaches to Richmond were guarded by 1,300 landmines in 1864. With many of them operated by chip cords to be pulled by hidden Confederates, marked by red flags during the day and lanterns at night. So the Confederates would mark off these landmines with little red flags so they knew where they were during the day. And at night, they would light them up with lanterns so they wouldn't be blowing themselves up. One of Rains' biggest problems was that there was not a foot of wire in the Confederacy for his electrical mines. He would send women operatives behind enemy lines to steal. His largest haul would come from an abandoned enemy cable in the Chesapeake Bay. Stripping it down, it would be used to build hundreds of mines. By one means or another, torpedoes spread throughout the Confederacy. 7 of 12 Union ships going up the Roanoke River in North Carolina were mine victims. A field of buried torpedoes in front of Fort Fisher helped hold the Union until near the very end of the war. At the end of the war, the United States Navy reported greater loss of ships from torpedoes than from all other causes combined, stating 35 ships lost. Rains estimated his bag of enemy ships sunk at 58. So Davis will send General Rains off to General Johnson in the Mississippi Department in an effort to help break the siege at Vicksburg. Johnson was not really a fan of Rains, and remember him from the Peninsula Campaign. You really will have nothing to do with him. He does not want him with him at all. So he sends Rains off to Mobile, Alabama to defend the Gulf Coast. Davis will countermand that order and send Rains to Charleston, South Carolina, where he's going to be received by General Beauregard. Beauregard, at that time, was in command of the District of South Carolina. And he was always open to new ideas. A perfect example would be, it was Beauregard who requested that the submarine Hundley be brought to Charleston to help break the blockade. So he was not opposed to trying new things to help save the city. March 12, 1863, Federal Secretary Gideon Welles wrote in his diary, "The attack on Charleston will be delayed. Little is known of obstructions and torpedoes, but great apprehensions are entertained." So what Rains would do in mining around the forts and in the harbor around Charleston, it would have a great effect. And with his help, Charleston will not fall to the Union Army until February 18th of 1865. And that's well after a week after Lee had surrendered to General Grant at Appomattox. As technology advanced, new political and ethical questions surfaced. The Union Navy initially disdained the use of mines on moral grounds, but their effectiveness eventually won out. David Farragut, flag officer in the United States Navy during the war, he wrote this in March 1864 in a letter to the Secretary of the Navy. "Torpedoes are not so agreeable when used by both sides. Therefore, I have reluctantly brought to myself to it. I have always deemed it unworthy of a chivalrous nation, but it does not do to give your enemy such a decided superiority over." So against it in the beginning, he was seen because of the effectiveness of it. He said, you know what, if you can't join them, you might as well, can't beat them, might as well join them and use the same type of warfare. Jefferson Davis, he rejects schemes to launch mine attacks from the Canadian canal locks on the Great Lakes and he was hesitant to destroy civilian targets. He was against doing that. Many in the Confederate Army continued to question how far the South really could go in taking mine warfare to the northern civilian life and commerce. So again, the latest Confederate Secretary of War, James Selden, he had to come up with a new rules of engagement. And he would say this as far as the open seas, he ordered passenger vessels of citizens of the United States on the high seas and private property in water, railroads, or within the territory of the United States not to be the subject of operations using exploding devices. But the property, public property of the enemy may be destroyed wherever it may be found. Battle of Mobile Bay, Alabama. Well, General Gabriel Rains finally does get sent down to Mobile, Alabama, and he quickly works on the defenses there, adding mines and improving the forts. Mobile, Alabama was one of the last major ports to go on the eastern coast, and it was a very important to keep that open. And so he sent there very late in the war to see what he can do to help defend it. This will give you a look at maybe what you might call a typical underwater torpedo. And Rains is going to put hundreds of these throughout the harbor. And you can see it's anchored down, so be held in place. Within that circle there, you can see the primer or firing pin, and that keg, oblong keg, that would hold up to, they were all different, up to maybe 90 pounds to 135 pounds of powder. And any enemy ship hitting those, they're going to go off. So the Battle of Mobile Bay will take place on August 5th, 1864, talking very late in the war. Commander for the Union Navy at the time for that fleet is David Farragut. And many will remember he's well known for issuing the phrase, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." Most likely he never really said those words. He probably said something like that. I think if you look back in history, he's quoted to maybe saying 4 or 5 different things that were close to that. More than likely, he said something like, "Damn the torpedoes," calling out to one of the flagships. But anyways, history has him as saying, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." So interesting battle. You had 18 Union warships versus only 4 for the Confederacy. Some of the key forts that need to be taken were Morgan and Gaines. Union casualties would be 300. Confederate casualties would only be about 35. You see there, our best monitor is sunk. Well, that is the USS Tecumseh. And that was the pride of Farragut's 18 fleet of ships. And it would be a total loss. And I'll talk a little bit about that on the next slide. So basically what's happening in this, you'll see in this lithograph, what's going to be happening in this battle. There's only about 4 Confederate ships, and the pride of their fleet, they had one really well-built ironclad, and that is going to be the CSS Tennessee. The Tecumseh wants to go for the Tennessee. And when she starts heading directly in there, she kind of creates a little bit of a logjam and cuts off some of her own ships, one being the USS Brooklyn. And it is there where Farragut is signaling to Brooklyn what's holding everything up. And that's when the signal comes back. Well, there's torpedoes up in front of us. We're trying to find our way around. And when he supposedly will say, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." Now, this will be a great victory for Farragut, but it almost turned out to be a disaster. It was not prudent of him to tell his fleet full speed ahead because he was sending his fleet into a field of torpedoes. Fortunately, luck was going to be on his side because what had happened was These torpedoes have been sitting in the water for so long, those firing pins have become corroded and they weren't going off. And sailors would talk about as they were going through these field of torpedoes that they can hear their ships banging against these floating torpedoes, but they weren't going off. They were almost all duds, but not all of them. There was one that was not a dud, and that is the one that the USS Tecumseh is going to hit, and it will be a direct hit. And she's going to sink in just a few minutes with a total loss of about 114 men, which would be almost half of the total loss that Farragut's Navy would suffer that day. A muffled explosion ripped into the ironclad's hull. A fountain of water went into the air. The Tecumseh shuddered and lurched violently, and her bow began to settle rapidly. The ship pitched out of sight like an arrow twanged from a bow. Now, what would end up probably being the most one-sided sea battle in history, the Confederates only had one ship left, and that would be the ironclad Tennessee. And she would be completely surrounded by Farragut's fleet. And talk about one side. And eventually, they would not sink the Tennessee. Tennessee eventually just had to surrender because she was totally surrounded, could not maneuver. So again, it will be a victory for Farragut, but he lucked out a little bit there because those Rains torpedoes would not explode because they were sitting in the water too long. So let's talk about dart grenades, or you may want to call them hand grenades. Rains is going to develop his primer to a land device he called a dart grenade, a Confederate version of William Ketchum's hand grenade. William Ketchum was the mayor of Buffalo, New York, and he had this patent made on August 20th of 1861. It was actually a pretty simple type of device. When the striker here would hit an object, the impact would hit the fuse, and this is filled with powder. This is the main body filled with powder, and it would set it off, igniting a powder charge. So, and basically this tail here would be so you can throw it a long way. Pretty neat device. So Rains actually didn't develop this, but what he did was he did make some improvements on it, and he put his own version of a primer into the head right here. Edward Porter Alexander, who many may know, was mostly General Longstreet's chief of artillery throughout the war. He would describe it this way. I also sent to Richmond to have a large lot of hand grenades made of a pattern which General Rains had recently devised. They were thin iron shells about the size of a goose egg, with powder and a sensitive paper percussion fuse in the front, and a 2-foot strap or strong cord to the rear end. A man could swing one of these and throw it 60 yards, and they would burst wherever they struck. So if you can imagine, there was like a 2-foot long rope hanging off the end of the tail, and they would just swing it over their head in a circle to build up momentum and then let it fly. And these things can fly off about a good 60 yards. You know, and the South wasn't the only ones using these. The Union were using them too. And one of the most famous accounts of Ketchum's hand grenades occurred during the Union assault near the Confederate works in Port Hudson in 1863. You can see over here on the right, there were different sizes made too. There's a 3-pound size and a 1-pound size. And I believe they even made a 5-pound size dart grenade. Confederate Howard Wright, Lieutenant Howard Wright, described the scene from the Confederate viewpoint. The enemy had come with a hand grenade to throw into our works, and when these novel missiles commenced falling upon our Arkansas boys, they did not know what to make of them. And the first few which they caught did not having burst. So they're catching these things. They don't even know what's coming over at them. They throw them back upon the enemy into their ditch, and this time they're exploding. And now they know what these things really are. And always equal to an emergency, they quickly devised a scheme of spreading blankets behind the parapets. So the grenades would be caught harmlessly into the blankets that they had spread out, and then they would pick them up and they would throw them back. So now you got both sides here picking up these dart grenades and flinging them back and forth at each other. So the ingenuity didn't stop there. So another neat thing they did with these dart grenades, this weapon also had its dual capabilities, and with the tail removed, it could be buried and used as a landmine. It was effective against foot soldiers and horses. Used to slow Sherman's advance in Georgia as landmines, they were also used as grenades in the Confederate defensive lines around Petersburg. So basically, what they did with these, they removed the tail and you turn it up on end, then just bury it into the ground. Now you have a very deadly small landmine for any foot soldier or horse to step on. And they would plant hundreds of these. During the course of the war, Rains would build factories in Richmond, Wilmington, Mobile, Charleston, and Savannah. And he had too little money to work with in the beginning. Originally, he was given $20,000, rose to $350 by 1864, finally up to $6 million, about $98 million in today's money, but it was too little, too late. Rear Admiral David Porter would say this: in devices for blowing up vessels, the Confederates were far ahead of us, putting Yankee ingenuity to shame. Post-war Civil War, it became kind of an arms race between other countries throughout the world. The ethnic questions would always follow as new war weapons were invented. And can't see my list here. Hold on one second. Just couldn't read my bottom screen. All right. Rains captured the morality of warfare, saying each new invention of war has been and denounced as barbarous and anti-Christian, yet each has taken its position by the universal consent of nations according to its efficiency for human slaughter. Never a want for powder. Story of George Washington Rains. Well, before we get into him a little bit, I just quickly want to talk a little bit about history of gunpowder. I won't take too long on this. So why was gunpowder invented? Well, experimenting with lifelong elixirs, China instead discovered gunpowder. And it's listed as one of the 4 great inventions of China. Now, most of you probably, or me, some of you may know what they are, and we know one of them is gunpowder. So the 4 is gunpowder. They're credited with printing, paper making, and the compass. When did China invent gunpowder? Well, it's around 700 AD. Dynasty emperors used gunpowder to put on great fireworks displays. 200 years later, in 904 AD, Chinese inventors saw that you could also use gunpowder as a weapon. At first, the army used fire arrows and fire spears. And the combination really hasn't changed much. It's made by 3 main ingredients, mixing sulfur, charcoal, and potassium nitrate. Some of the early uses of gunpowder as a weapon: an arrow strapped with gunpowder ready to be shot from a bow. And an older depiction, they would use fire rockets or fire arrow rockets, and probably would work something like this. I know we covered a little bit of history here. Winfield Scott Anaconda Plan. And early in the war, Winfield Scott, who was a marvelous general, hero of the War of 1812, commanded the force that captured Mexico City in 1848. In the first year of the war, he's Lincoln's main military advisor. And he said, well, the way to defeat the South is you got to blockade all the ports. You got to take control of the Mississippi, cut the Confederacy in half, and squeeze them into submission. And most people really laughed at that because they never thought the war was going to last that long. But in the end, old Winfield Scott was right. That's really what would happen. And you can see this illustration showing the anaconda snake straggling the South into submission. And this will hurt the South because it would limit things they can import that they mainly needed to support the war, including gunpowder. Confederate President Jefferson Davis would say this: hardly a round of ammunition had been made in the South for 50 years, except during the Mexican War. When the war began, the South had only enough powder to maybe last a month. This deficiency would be satisfied largely by one man, 1842 West Point graduate, Mexican War veteran, and accomplished engineer, chemist, and businessman, George Washington Rains. The younger brother of Gabriel, George Rains, would provide most of the powder for torpedoes, mines, shells, and virtually all of the Confederates' munitions. So when the war started, the South had but two means to get powder. Gunpowder owned by the U.S., stored in arsenals scattered throughout the South. Of course, they would be seized by troops that were succeeding, and they would gather up the powder in those arsenals. Two, powder purchased from the Northern Powder Mill, specifically the Hazard Powder Company of Hazardville, Connecticut, the largest powder mill in the North. And at its peak, it would operate with 125 total buildings. The purchase of the Northern Powder Mills, surprisingly, is going to continue early after secession. But of course, this supply is not nearly going to be enough. And surprisingly, early in the war, not early in the war, but initially when the war started, the South approached the Hazard Powder Company and asked them if they would build a powder plant in the South. And of course, that never materialized. But at one point, they bought up their entire inventory of powder. Like I said, three main ingredients for making gunpowder really hasn't changed much. For Civil War black powder, it's a granular mixture of 15% charcoal, 75% potassium nitrate, and 10% sulfur. Charcoal provides the carbon and other fuel for reaction. Willow trees was best used. South had a very short supply of that, and that would run out. So Rains would use the cottonwood tree and to make his charcoal because there was an ample supply available. The potassium nitrate is most important ingredient in terms of bulk and function because its combustion process releases oxygen, promoting the rapid burning of other ingredients. So he goes around like a prospector in the limestone caves of Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, Arkansas, to look for the earth rich in nitrate of lime. Puts his crews work to digging it. By a chemical process, the saturation with lye, he renders the earth into saltpeter. And to meet the demand, still, crews would dig the earth from privies, latrines, and even collect contents from chamber pots. As you can imagine, that created some bawdy songs between both sides of the war about what that gunpowder was made out of. The Confederacy even put out bulletins to their citizens to contribute so they can get niter. Niter is urgently wanted for public defenses. At present, it is the first want of service. No words can sufficiently impress this want upon the patriotic families. Sulfur, which while also served as a fuel, lowers the temperature required to ignite mixture, thereby increasing the rate of combustion. Rain supply sulfur mostly comes from Louisiana planters who had imported most of it before the war to refine sugar crops. And he would make some innovations. Rains, using a microscope, he saw that evenly, finely grounded carbon particles were pitted with tiny holes. With potassium nitrate, the active ingredient, he's going to reduce the powder into a slush so the niter could crystallize into the carbon. And he's going to make into these powder cakes. And he would make different size powder cakes needing on what ordnance they would need to supply. Now, just to recap, like I said, three main ingredients. You got your charcoal, your potassium nitrate, your sulfur, and you get your black powder. Of course, I would always want to test it to make sure my combination of ingredients is going to work. So you're going to at least want to add a fuse to it, get a match struck, and we'll run our test. Okay, that combination seems to work all right. Early in the war, Rains had converted an idle mill near Nashville, Tennessee, into making gunpowder, beginning in July 1861. And by late October, it was turning out 3,000 pounds of powder a day. The huge Treasure Iron Works built for Rains 12 circular iron plates, 24 5-ton rollers, about 250 tons of machinery for his powder mill. He's going to make a massive powder works mill in Augusta we're going to talk about. So right here, these rollers, get this image here, these rollers will be made to grind and pulverize the nitrate and the carbon so they can get a fine powder. He's going to be guided by a pamphlet written by a British artillery officer describing the powder works, and he builds one in Augusta gunpowder mill. He chose the old United States Arsenal site between the canal and the Savannah River and as a secure inland location with good rail and water connections. Construction is going to begin in September of 1861. The buildings were separated and designed to survive explosions with raw materials starting at one end, refined and ground and finished powder loaded in 1.5 miles down the line. The powder works was producing gunpowder in just 7 months in 1862. You know what, Dave? I have this. I got to move this. It's blocking my vision. There we go. Sorry, guys. The original plan, Augusta Powder Works and their 20 buildings. Now, this is a sketch from Rains's notes of how it was laid out. And so you can recognize some of the buildings here. There'll be the refinery. You can see this, the furnace chimney, and that's it right here. That's the actual picture of it. So there's the refinery building, carpenter shop, blacksmith shop, laboratory, steaming and mixing house, the pulverizing house, sifting house, cooling magazine, and granulating house. And most of these buildings were separated over 1,000 yards apart so to keep them safe from each other. Also, a railway track running through here to move the product. Interesting, what they did was that railway track is made out of oak. They build oak rails. Purpose of that being so they didn't have metal on metal from wheels of the train cars and the track causing sparks, which would could you ignite coal dust and causing an explosion. But Civil War gunpowder factories were not safe places, as you can imagine. And an author once wrote, warning readers, we should never advise anyone who is not called by duty to visit a powder factory, for you run the risk of being blown to nothing. But Rains would give ample attention to safety. His ordnance manual suggested that before the men began work each day, a tarp will be placed on the floor of each building. When the day was done, the tarp was removed at least 50 yards from the building and swept for dust. Copper was used when possible in place of iron to avoid generating spark. If iron nails were used, they were countersunk and covered with putty. Rains required his men to wear rubber shoes and not to drag their feet. Rolling mills featured walls as thick as 10 feet, and the buildings along the canal were separated by at least 1,000 yards to prevent any explosion from setting off a chain of blasts. 30-gallon water tanks lined the area above the boilers, and they were rigged to drench to powder the moment a fire started. During its 3 years of operation, the Augusta Works suffered only 4 explosions, 2 of which were minor incidents causing no injury. However, there was one major one, and the most serious one was an explosion occurred just outside a temporary granulating building while a foreman known for enforcing safety regulations was absent. It blew up 3 tons of powder, killing 7 men, a boy, and 2 mules in the blast. And they believe it was caused by a workman smoking against violations of Rains' strict rules. Rains also designed a superior powder box to replace kegs for shipment and reported that there were no explosions in delivery. The plant never worked to capacity, and a 22,000-pound rush order from Charleston only took 2 days to produce. Powder captured there at Augusta was used after the war by the United States School of Artillery practice and was pronounced superior. The Augusta Works was able to remain open until very late in the war. And to give a reason why, in General Sherman's March to the Sea, here's where he's going to be tracking, going all the way to the sea to Savannah. But the powder works in Augusta is here. So he totally bypasses that, which a little bit surprises me that they would not go after that, because at that time in the war, it was very lightly defended just by some home guard. So because of that, the powder works will stay open till the very end. Confederate Powder Works was the second largest gunpowder factory in the world at the time during the 19th century, producing 3.5 tons a day. More than 2.75 million pounds of the first quality gunpowder was produced there before its closure in April 18, 1865. By comparison, Union gunpowder manufacture were distributed among mills, with the larger, the Hazard Powder Company that we talked about earlier, producing 40% of the annual production for them. Now, at the request of Rains, the smokestack was left standing as a memorial to those who fought for the Confederacy. This is the only structure left from the entire powder works. It has been said that the Confederacy never lost a battle for lack of powder. Following the end of the war, Gabriel Rains worked as a chemist in Augusta, Georgia, but later moved to Charleston, South Carolina, where he worked as a civilian clerk in the U.S. Army Quartermaster Department. He died in Aiken, South Carolina on August 6, 1881, and he's buried in St. Thaddeus Cemetery. George Rains had been called the chief chemist of the Confederacy, and after the war, Rains stayed in Augusta, chose an academic life. He lectured as a professor of chemistry at the Medical College of Georgia. Also becoming its dean, he retired in 1894 and returned to Newburgh. He died there on March 21st, 1898, at 81 years old, and is buried at St. George's Cemetery. Due to their efforts for 4 long years, they reigned terror on the Union Army. Thank you all very much for listening. I'm going to stop sharing.